So here's an overview of the strategy in Istanbul. An interesting race because started damp, but never really got to slick tyres. And there's a few outliers that you can see. The norm here was for people to pit around lap 36. Lando Norris kicked the pit stops off in the top 10 by pitting on lap 34. But there was always a scratching of the heads from the drivers in the pit were thinking, can we go to the end? There was no need to pit because in wet conditions, you don't need to use two different compounds of tyre. And in fact, Esteban Ocon here did the whole race without a pit stop. That is what these two, who are clear outliers, Charles Leclerc, lap 47 pitting, and Lewis Hamilton on lap 50, they were trying to do the same thing. But ultimately, it probably wasn't the way to go for anyone. Ocon just about survived it. But for Leclerc and Hamilton, they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place and ended up both losing out marginally. So let's focus on Hamilton then, the championship rival. Charles Leclerc clearly lost out. He was running in third. For a moment, looked like he might even fight for the win. I can understand why Ferrari left him out, but they're not playing for the championship. Go for the win. In the end, lost the rear tyres and had to pit lap 47. Hamilton, slightly different scenario. He's playing for the championship. He had better tyre life as well than Leclerc. When Leclerc was plummeting, as we can see from this graph here, Charles Leclerc is the red in the Ferrari colours. And that's the moment here where his tyres just start to go off a cliff. He's leading from Bottas. It's all looking measured, but they just go. And he has no choice but to pit. He's going to be swamped by everyone. But for Lewis Hamilton, who was the other driver to stay out, it was a harder decision to make. And Lewis was very unhappy after the race. He thought that Mercedes hadn't made the right call. It ended up not being a great position for him. Lewis in the teal line further down, the solid teal, you can see he's running in fifth from here and is basically fighting with Sergio Perez. They're wheel to wheel at this point, and at the end, you can see he's a long way adrift of Perez, who's the dark blue dotted line. So it's not weighed out, the strategy. He was fifth, he finished fifth. On the face of it, there's a net neutral there, but was there an opportunity for him to do more? So we've had a little look at the numbers, and it's really, really tough to judge. Mercedes and Lewis will have had a sit down after the race as well and tried to pour through the numbers. But ultimately, I think the right call was a tricky one, but it was to pit in the first instance where Perez had pitted, or Verstappen and Bottas early on. And there's a number of factors at play here. So let's have a look at what happened for Hamilton. So Perez pits at this point, and Mercedes understandably keep Hamilton out, thinking, can we do something magical here? Can we go to the end? Can we get to possibly a position where we can put some slick tyres on and then the race is really coming towards them at the end? But that was never going to be the case. And Sebastian Vettel pretty comprehensively proved that earlier on. So here is the next point. That dotted line down there is the scenario where Hamilton pits at the first time Mercedes called him in. But he didn't pit. He ignored them and he carried on for a few more laps. Mercedes thought he should have pitted then. Lewis thought otherwise. And in the end, Pete Bonington on the radio said, OK, we'll deliberate for a few more laps. The next point was this one, where the teal comes down. That's where Hamilton does pit. And the other options here, the black line and the dotted black line, are two possible options had he tried to go to the end. So let's look first at the options here, where he tries to go to the end. And this is not pitting, looking at two different levels of degradation that he might have had. So the top level, the solid black line, is what happens if he can manage the degradation to the end in a similar sort of way. You can see the drop-off from the teal line above. It's going down, he's losing the tyres. But if he could just about nurse them to the end, then that's going to be the solid black line. And you can see it ends up just about above Sergio Perez, right at the end. So it's going to be an okay situation. Now, maybe Perez here, knowing there's a car ahead, can push and find a little bit more pace. So probably you'd say that Perez, with the rate that he's just coming up at this moment, probably you'd say, had Hamilton been ahead of him, there might have been a bit more incentive for him to find a bit more pace, and Lewis probably finishes fourth in that scenario. But maybe there's a fight with Perez and you never know how it goes. But that's probably an optimistic view of how Hamilton's tyres would have gone, given how Leclerc's fell off a cliff. And the perfect example is Esteban Ocon, who lost a lot of time at the end. He lost 5 seconds to Antonio Giovinazzi in the last lap. So that is displayed by this dotted black line. That's the option where he stays out on the initial set of intermediates. He does the whole race on them, but he has the level of degradation that you might expect given what happened to Leclerc, but Leclerc was much earlier, and also what happened to Esteban Ocon. The degradation's still slightly kinder than Ocon's, because Hamilton looked like he was keeping his tyres in slightly better shape maybe than the Alpine driver, but still, you've got the natural drop-off, and here you can see he's going to finish just in behind Charles Leclerc. They're going to have a fight now at the end. So given that, he's probably going to finish fourth. Possibly Leclerc's going to have a run at him at the end. And the same thing, as I said, for Perez. If Leclerc knows there's a driver just ahead of him, there's a chance that Leclerc can find that little bit more pace as well. And Hamilton on ailing tyres would be really struggling to defend. So if he stayed out, there's a chance he could fight for third with Perez. If Perez and Leclerc do the same thing, there's a chance that he'll fight for third, but probably he'll finish fourth if the degradation is as good as you could hope for. In reality, looking at other people's, the degradation would be a bit worse. The most likely outcome is he finishes down in fifth, which is where he finished anyway. Of course, the worst case scenario, if he stayed out, was that he has a blowout, a tyre failure. With the tyres getting right down to the carcass, you can suddenly lose all temperature, they don't work, and you can actually have a tyre failure. And this is what Mercedes were seeing. They were seeing the temperatures drop, and they were preempting here the chance that Hamilton could have an absolute tyre failure. And at that point, he's going to have to, if he doesn't retire from the race, come back into the pits, and he's going to lose loads more to the likes of Gasly, to Norris, to Sainz coming through. And of course, there's a chance of a DNF as well. And for a driver and team thinking about the championship, the best case in here was a minute chance that he could hold on to third. Taking fifth wasn't the absolute outcome, but it was probably the right thing for Mercedes to do, given they didn't pit in the first place. But let's have a look at these earlier examples. So this line here is the time where Mercedes wanted Hamilton to pit.
Box, 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 box.
Why?
New inset is the way to go. We're under threat from
I don't think it is, man. Is it much quicker?
And this is probably the right decision, given they didn't pit initially. So the best decision, I think, would be pitting initially with Perez, with Verstappen, with Bottas, and just trying to race them to the end. But as he didn't have track position, it's a little bit negative for Mercedes to do that. And just hope that Hamilton can beat Perez on track. Strategy is normally a chance for someone behind to do something a little bit different, and that's what Mercedes were trying. But the crucial part in all of these strategies is, look at the lines at the bottom here. You can see normally when you go for new tyres, you find a lot of pace. You find the undercut, we've seen it be sort of 3 seconds per lap sometimes. In Turkey, it just wasn't the case. So you've got all these lines that are fairly flat lines. Hamilton initially goes for a lap. This is what he did do, went for one quick lap, but then just overheated the tyres and has degradation. And only in the last couple of laps, he actually found a bit more pace again. Now, that's the nature of an intermediate tyre working on actually a pretty dry track. The tread's there, it's moving around, you're overheating the tyres, they're out of the temperature window, and then they're going to grain up.
What position am I in, man?
So currently P5.
You should have come in, man. Got massive graining, man. I told you!
Okay, copy Lewis. We were losing time to Perez, but we'll chat about it later.
And that is why, fundamentally, those that pitted earlier actually stood the most to gain, because whilst they couldn't do the undercut, and initially Leclerc was doing okay against Valtteri Bottas out front, once Bottas went through that phase, he was just so much quicker on the inters. The undercut wasn't working, but still, it kind of effectively was, in a sense, that you had to go through 4 laps or so of graining to then be able to unleash a lot more pace. So the earlier you went through that, in the end it was better because it gave you a chance to attack, and that's what happened with Perez on Leclerc as well. But had Hamilton pitted at this point, he might have been able to have a run. You never know what Leclerc would have done, of course, in this situation. But Lewis, let's say he drove at a similar rate to what he did before, then he's still got this little spike up. He'd be fighting with Perez and probably overheating the tyres a little bit as well. Then he'd have the classic drop here as the tyres go through an overheating phase and some graining. But then he'd have a decent run to the end, and he'd try and come back to Perez and be fighting for third. Now, all of these are sort of estimations of what you might have expected, given other people's degradation, given what happened to Lewis after he pitted, and, of course, trying to take into account the ability of someone to overtake. But basically what it all shows is, whilst Lewis was very disgruntled in the car at the time, He was upset after the race that he hadn't followed his gut, thinking that actually the right idea was just to stay out. Probably the reality is he finished 5th. Best case, it's 3rd, but worst case, it's out of the race. Mercedes here, they didn't have any magic tricks, but in this case, I think Mercedes probably ended up roughly on the right call.
Okay, Liz, so that's P5. So sorry about that. We'll have to chat to you, talk you through the call.
And the reason they had to pit Hamilton when he did in the end was because of this. Pierre Gasly actually charging up in the AlphaTauri. So that was the last moment they could have basically aborted from their no-stop race. And they did it, so they kept what they had, which was 5th place.
I think we tried at a certain stage to hang it out and maybe finish 3rd, but then the pace dropped off so much it was clear that we would have also been overtaken by Perez and Leclerc in any case, so we had decided to pit. So either you played very conservative and you fight it out on track with Perez and Leclerc, or you take a little bit of a gamble with a bit of bigger probability. That's what we did, and ended up 5th where we were before that.
That was a look at a few what-if scenarios for Hamilton's much-disputed strategy at the Turkish Grand Prix. There was plenty of other incident in the race, including a cracking battle between he and Sergio Perez, and many incidents for some of the midfielders as well. For more, check it out on F1 TV.